In an op-ed out today by our friend and colleague, and more importantly, former senior FBI official Andrew Weissmann points out one potential danger for the president if his White House legal team attempts to claim executive privilege to prevent former National Security Advisor John Bolton from testifying. Andrew writes, quote, the White House might never truly want to litigate the executive privilege question. That's because it could cause a federal court or the Chief Justice in short order to make the determination that the president committed a crime. As a threshold question, the judge will most probably look to whether an exception to executive privilege applies. As former State Department legal advisor Harold Koh and his co-authors explained in a thorough analysis of executive privilege and its exceptions, quote, government officials cannot use constitutional privileges to hide evidence of crime. Joining us at our table, the author of said op-ed, former senior FBI official Andrew Weissmann. Take us through what you're writing and what you're sort of trying to get ahead of in terms of the legal and political arguments you think are coming.
Sure. So we're turning the audience into law students.
Yes, I want like some
that.
credits.
Yeah, okay. So we'll give you credit for maybe 2 points for this. So what we're trying to get ahead of is what's going to happen if Bolton is called. And it's really an argument that's being made now as to why Republicans who are leaning one way or the other might decide, you know what, let's not call him because it's going to be this extended battle. And so it's not worth it. Well, there's reason to think that the White House may be bluffing because a lot of people say, well, why wouldn't they go to court? Why not do this? There's no downside to them. And there are two real downsides for the White House pursuing a claim of executive privilege. And that is that, one, the president has sort of scrupulously avoided making any statement to either the House or the Senate as to what happened. If you notice, he says things publicly, but he has actually not submitted anything in writing. And there's a reason for that, because the criminal law attaches a penalty if you lie to the Senate or to the House. But if you make a claim of executive privilege, the court is going to want to know what happened. And so one of the things that the court asks is, OK, is there an exception to executive privilege? One well-known exception would be crime fraud, which is executive privilege applies to senior advisors providing legitimate advice. That's unexceptional. It applies whether it's a Democratic president or a Republican president. But if it's done in furtherance of a crime, bets are off. No court's going to say, no, that's no problem. That's executive privilege. So the court's going to first say to the president's team, well, what do you say happened? We've heard from the Democrats, but do you dispute that? At which point they have to put something, they have to say something to the court. Well, you know what? If you lie to the court, there are penalties for that. Second, the court then makes a finding.
Can I ask you about that, though? Because I think there's a feeling, and I hear this at drop-off and in the dog park, there's a feeling of hopelessness. I mean, there's a penalty, but the Trump team seems to just plow through penalties. Is the penalty something that could turn the tide and get John Bolton to testify, or is the penalty just something that Trump would pardon himself for down the road?
Well, the whole issue about whether the president can pardon himself is it's like a whole can of worms. I actually think that can't possibly be the case. But here's a downside. I mean, just take the political reality. Does the president want to have a court finding, that either side was not candid? You don't want that. Let's assume he gets through this impeachment. He's running for office. You don't want an independent judicial officer making that finding. But more important, even if he gets away with the lying part, which is that he puts in a statement and the court says, I don't believe it, I think the Democrats are right, the court makes a finding of whether the crime fraud exception applies. And there, the court would actually make a finding by a preponderance of the evidence that this was in furtherance of a crime. That could be extremely devastating, not so much into, yes, it could help with the impeachment, but even if you have sort of Claire's, cynical view, which I'm increasingly being educated about, and you think, okay, he'll still get through the impeachment, he's got to run on that.
What do you mean by extremely devastating, though? He would have committed a crime? I mean, didn't Mueller find him to have committed 10 crimes? SDNY called him an unindicted co-conspirator?
There wasn't a finding in the Mueller report. But here you would have a judge making a finding. So let me give you an example. During the Mueller investigation, the chief judge of the D.C. court, it's the court that would hear any claim that the president makes of executive privilege, the chief judge has written a lengthy opinion that found that Paul Manafort could not assert the attorney-client privilege, which is actually a stronger privilege than the executive privilege. And the reason? Because of the crime fraud exception.
So he was using it to cover up criminal conduct.
Exactly. So the court issued a finding that the court, found that there was a crime fraud exception to this and that Paul Manafort had committed this crime. Now, he was not running for office. So for him, the downside is not as great as it would be for someone who's worried about what are the ramifications if I actually have a judge in the D.C. circuit making a finding that there was a crime. And there's obviously been lots of talk about what the possible crimes could be. It could be bribery, extortion, and much easier one, campaign finance.
Right.
So all of those
even some folks
applied.
at the Justice Department will concede privately that that was a legitimate question or pursuit.
I would think career people would have every reason to think that.
I have a million more questions for you, but I'm told that Lindsey Graham's talking, and we're going to listen.
Any evidence of